Fragments of a Digital Heart by Elton Gar. Theo walked through the small domed market overlooking the dry red surface of Mars, carefully picking out food. When he found something new or particularly good, he would tap his card against the plate on the side of the cart, giving the person a kudo. Once his bag was full, he began the walk home. Running late from work, he took a shortcut. Years ago, stepping out of the dome onto the unshielded surface of Mars made his stomach turn, but now it hardly bothered him. Or at least he had almost convinced himself that it didn't bother him. There was no oxygen or radiation. His stomach turned at the thought, but he reminded himself that no matter how real this looked or felt, it was all simply a digitally constructed world. The only thing real was the robot he had teleprojected into, and the slow, methodical cleaning of the world after the resource wars. His home was inside another dome, but this one lacked a convenient door. Cate, his wife, insisted it broke the immersion, and she was the expert. She had helped design hundreds of towns, each with a different setting, but all designed to feel real. Since this was his property, the door wasn't needed. He turned off the intangibility of the dome for a second and stepped through. Cate didn't love him doing that, but as long as it wasn't permanent, she mostly ignored it. The house was designed to look like it was built on Mars, but felt like an Earth home. The bricks were made from Martian rock, and there were only a few touches of wood. After quickly going through the airlock, he tossed his groceries on the table and found Cate in the kitchen.
"You're late,"
she said.
I was helping Theta shift with some larger rubble before I logged out. It took almost an hour,
Theo said.
"Did you ask for overtime?"
Cate chuckled. She had been working more hours than him for almost 80 years, and occasionally reminded him of it. Her job had a far more immediate effect than his, while he regretted the hours he spent working instead of with family before he and the rest of the world had been digitized.
I might have, but since no one gets paid, it seemed a waste of time,
Theo said, dramatically dropping into the recliner to make it clear how exhausted he was. Though of course, it was the robot who had done all the work.
"And how was your day, Cate?"
Cate asked, as she sat next to Theo in the wide recliner, leaning her head against his.
Right. Good question,
Theo said, being reminded of an old and mostly playful argument.
"The think tank is stuck. We don't know how to combine the DNA of people who don't have DNA, and it already feels artificial, so no one is willing to risk raising a child if we don't know if it's going to even feel human."
So the same as the last 2 years,
Theo said, realizing as soon as he said it that it was a mistake. Cate's lighthearted tone changed to one that was genuinely upset.
"You had kids. That's something a lot of us are never going to get,"
Cate said.
had being the important word in that sentence.
Theo said, his voice rising but not quite to the point where he was shouting. They both sat in silence for a moment. They were mature enough to get over it, but a few seconds of silence helped separate out the moment of frustration for both of them. That moment was interrupted as Cate said,
"Since we're already on the subject, the Connection Project is running a pilot program and is looking for volunteers."
I thought they were stuck the same way you were. Lack of DNA makes it far more difficult to find people who are related, so most reunions happened decades ago, or are just random chance,
Theo said.
"They found a way to use memories as a sort of makeshift fingerprint. With your permission, they will take a couple of your most important memories and then scan the database for others that have memories similar enough to trigger the algorithm. There are likely to be some false positives, but there are things that are likely to be similar. Perhaps a car crash you were both in, or other things."
like dropping your child off at kindergarten together. I was working that day,
Theo said.
"Or a marriage ceremony, or the birth of a child, a funeral. There are a lot of possibilities."
As long as they don't actually get to see those, I don't care. But they aren't going to find anyone,
Theo said. He had spent the first 5 years searching and Cate had helped him, but it had been clear his family wasn't there.
"Good, because I already told them it was okay."
Theo's heart pounded as he stepped off the virtual train into the nostalgic 1950s-style town. The station, with its polished wood benches, brass fixtures, and large clock tower, evoked an era long past. He walked through the streets, lined with vintage cars and white picket fences. The only thing missing were children playing in the park. Theo felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with apprehension. As he made his way to the park, he spotted a group of people near a wooden bench under a large oak tree. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized Eliza, Maggie, and Arthur. Eliza looked the same as she did the day he had last seen her, but also older and wiser, though she had only been here for 30 years while he had been here for 100. Theo paused, overwhelmed by the sight of his family after so many years. He took a deep breath and stepped forward.
Eliza, Maggie, Arthur.
His voice trembled.
It's me, Theo.
Eliza turned slowly, her eyes widening in disbelief.
Theo, is it really you?
Maggie looked up, her eyes narrowing as she tried to recognize him.
What should we call you?
She asked. Arthur remained silent, his arms crossed.
You can call me Theo. Or whatever feels right to you. I've missed you all so much.
Eliza took a step forward, her eyes scanning his face.
We thought you were gone.
I was woken in the first wave. I looked everywhere for you. But you hadn't been woken up yet. So by the time you were, it had been 70 years, and I had given up hope.
Eliza's expression softened slightly.
We made a life here. It wasn't easy raising the children alone, but we managed.
Maggie took a deep breath.
Growing up here wasn't bad. There were other children back then.
I wish I had been here to see it.
Arthur finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper.
Why didn't they wake us sooner?
Theo glanced at Cate, who stood a few paces back, giving them space but watching with concern.
The world was chaos, and computer space is always at a premium. They had to wake people up in stages.
Eliza glanced at Cate, her eyes curious.
And who is she?
This is Catherine, but everyone calls her Cate. She's been my support these past years.
Cate stepped forward, offering a warm but tentative smile.
Hello. It's wonderful to finally meet you all. Theo has told me so much about you.
Eliza raised an eyebrow.
Are you the same Catherine who helped design this town?
Cate nodded.
Yes. I wanted something that would feel like the real world, but would focus on the best parts. Every town is different. This one was designed to encourage a community to help raise children.
Cate stopped as she said that. Maggie, seeming to be taking the lead, said,
There were a lot of good people. Most of them are still here. In many ways, it's like the whole town is family.
That was always the plan. We knew that things might be difficult, so a good foundation was important. How much school did you have?
Cate asked.
I'm still in school. Taking my 3rd degree. This one is in engineering.
Maggie said, then glanced at Arthur and said,
And Arthur is studying human anatomy, though I have no idea why, since it barely exists anymore.
If we're going to repopulate the Earth with people at some point, it would be good if people knew how biological bodies work. Besides, there are always think tanks trying to make the constructs more realistic.
Arthur said, speaking freely for the first time, though Theo suspected that was because Maggie had baited him into it.
And what about you two? Did you have any kids, Catherine?
Eliza asked. Theo glanced at Cate. He didn't think that Eliza was trying to be mean, but she really should know better. Though every place had different rules, and he suspected most of the people in this town had children, so perhaps it wasn't the same sore subject. Cate hesitated, her eyes flicking to Theo before she answered.
No. I didn't before. I can't have children.
Eliza's eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing between her and Cate.
That must be hard.
Cate nodded, her voice quiet.
But I've tried to make a difference in other ways, like helping design these towns, and I'm part of a project that is trying to figure out how we can have children in the digital realm.
I thought the plan was to leave.
Arthur said.
Not exactly. We don't have bodies anymore, so the best we'll ever have is robots to teleproject into. The plan is that once the Earth can support them, We grow children in artificial wombs and help them as they return to the physical realm. Learning how to do things here is a big part of that,
Theo said. Arthur must have known some of that, but Theo understood the desire to be real again. Instead of saying that, he turned to Cate and said,
"Thank you for making this place. It really does feel like home."
Cate smiled gently, but Theo could sense the tension that still hung in the air. He watched his family's cautious expressions, realizing that the road to rebuilding their bonds would be much longer than he had hoped. Theo cleared his throat, trying to bridge the gap.
Perhaps we should take this slow.
Eliza nodded slowly, her eyes still wary but softening.
I think a couple of days is a good idea. This has been a lot of information already.
I agree. We can talk through email or phones and work out our next meeting without the pressure.
Cate said, and she took Theo by the arm. He wanted to hug his kids. He wanted to move to this town and see them every day to make up for lost time. But he also knew that wasn't how time worked. You didn't make up for it. You just moved forward. Theo and his family had spent almost a week communicating, only to decide where to meet. Cate insisted it not be at either of their homes. They needed someplace neutral where anyone who needed to leave felt free to do so. They finally decided on the diner in the town where the family lived. The three of them were already sitting in one of the booths when Theo and Cate walked in. A tall black man in a cook's apron watched Theo carefully as he approached.
He seems nice,
Cate said.
He's just being overprotective,
Maggie said, and she smiled at two women who were holding hands in the booth across from them while giving Theo the side eye.
So is there anyone here on my side?
Theo asked as he slid into the booth on the other side of the table from them.
That depends on if you keep pretending I'm not here or not,
Cate said playfully as she slid in next to him.
I didn't know Catherine was going to be here.
Eliza said.
She's my wife.
and we're glad she's here. We just would have picked a bigger table,
Maggie said, though she was clearly lying.
Perhaps it would be easier for everyone if we picked a subject that isn't going to make anyone uncomfortable.
Cate said, and she picked up the menu.
So what is good?
It's all good.
Eliza said.
Mom, we discussed this. We need to be nice to her.
Arthur said.
No, I don't think we do.
Cate said. She was an expert on people, and she must have seen this coming.
I'm the person who took her husband away, and now I'm walking around here with him. I got to spend the life with him that she was supposed to, and instead she had to raise kids. Kids who she clearly loves, alone. Perhaps if it hadn't been for me, he would have kept looking for all of you. Did I miss anything?
Eliza looked at her for a moment and said,
You're younger and prettier than I am. And I'm pretty sure you're smarter too.
You can look like anything you want to here.
Theo said, and before the words were all the way out, he was kicked in the shin hard. He glanced at Cate, but it was Maggie who had the grin on her face, and she said,
Perhaps we should go to the counter and order.
Since she was in the middle, she was able to force Arthur to get up to let her out. Theo considered staying, but the look from his daughter reminded him enough of the look that her mother used to give him when she wasn't interested in discussing something, that he just went. Once they reached the counter, Theo glanced at the menu and said,
I have no idea what to order. What is good?
It's all good.
The owner said.
I told you the same as Mom. Be nice. The conspiracy theories aren't true.
Maggie said.
The what?
Theo said.
People think that you found us because your wife is trying to find people to be part of an experiment raising digital children.
Arthur said.
That's absurd. There is no shortage of people who want to have kids. The think tank's problem is the number of people angry at them for not experimenting on them. But Cate refuses to even consider it until they have a reasonable chance that it will actually work.
Theo said.
I hope it will be soon. Aaron and I have been wanting a child for a decade.
Maggie said.
They're not as far off as they think they are. But I can't convince Cate of that.
Theo said, then added,
But I will admit I am glad I might get to see my grandchild being born. I've already missed so much.
They returned to the table as Cate said,
And I don't much like you either. My husband has been happy for the last 50 years, and now you show up, and he's almost as upset as when we first arrived. He hasn't slept in a week.
Sleep is an affectation, and I've had a lot to do,
Theo said, making sure they knew he was there.
You have always had a lot to do when the option was spending time with me or your children,
Eliza said. Theo took a step back, and this time Cate really did stand up. He had only ever seen her angry a few times, and it was always on someone else's behalf. She glanced at Maggie and Arthur, who likely had been told this their whole lives, helping to explain some of the resistance, and she said,
You know he's been refusing think tank jobs for decades, and he won't become a foreman at the cleanup because of the guilt of working too much when he had a family. He missed you, of course, we all miss people, but his regret was not spending time with you when he could. I've been trying to get him to do more for 50 years, because work is good for people. But he insists on punishing himself. I had hoped that you might convince him that he can do more. But perhaps I misjudged you.
Most of the anger left Eliza's face. And Theo realized for the first time that she wasn't as old as he had thought. She simply hadn't relaxed since she had seen him. But she looked at them and then said,
I've been angry for a long time. But I think Catherine is good for you, Theo.
She's good for a lot of people. I just get the chance to spend more time with her than most,
Theo said.
Sure. If you call wasting time on a project that will never work being good for people,
Cate said.
You mean the reproduction think tank?
Eliza said.
We've been discussing disbanding. There is no good way to create a biological connection without biology. The child may look like the parents, but there is no genetic connection.
Cate said. Eliza put her hands on Cate's and asked,
That's your problem.
The biggest one. The one that has stopped us from running a test program. Beyond that, we can't be entirely certain what they'll be like until we run the program.
Cate said. This time Eliza laughed.
You think that knowing what someone is going to be like before they are born is representative of parenthood?
Cate glanced at Theo, who shrugged and said,
She spent a lot more time with the kids than me. But I've been telling you for a while that those problems are superficial.
And what happens when they turn out so differently that people don't want to raise them?
Cate said.
Most humans won't abandon their children, even when they start playing with fire in the basement.
She glanced at Arthur as she said that, and he shrugged.
Or in the other world when they got cancer or some other horrific disease, back when that was possible. Don't worry, Catherine. You'll understand once you're a mother.
Eliza said.
You don't understand. I'm the one responsible for this. What if I made a mistake? What if something I did means they come out wrong?
Cate asked. This time it was Theo who laughed, and Maggie chuckled too. Cate turned on them and said,
And why are you laughing?
Because you just described what it's like having a child. I remember when Eliza was pregnant with Arthur. She used to not be able to sleep at night because she was worried that she wasn't getting enough sleep for the baby.
So that's what's wrong with him.
Maggie said, and she elbowed her brother in the ribs.
If people let fear stop them from having children, then there would be a lot less people. Perhaps that's why nature made it a little less in our control. I think you have to try. See how it works out.
Eliza said.
There are no other children. At least not many. It's going to be another 5 years before the computers are ready for another major expansion. I'd need to find a small town where we could have a test group. At least 5 or 6 people who were willing to try.
Eliza looked up at Maggie, whose eyes were beginning to fill with tears, and Eliza said,
There is another thing you'll learn about being a parent. They'll do almost anything for their children, including forgiving people for things that they never should have been angry about. Cate, how do you feel about being a grandmother?
Even once it was decided, it still took almost a year to prepare the digital children. There was some grumbling about that, but Cate had a way to solve that too. She wrote a pregnancy program that simulated much of the feeling of having children. She even hired a programmer who created a program that allowed for natural and painful childbirth if someone wanted it. The option was nice, but most of the women decided that it wasn't actually necessary to go through all of that.
The due date was 3 days ago. Is something going wrong?
Maggie asked.
You said you wanted a natural experience. So I suggested that we need to have some variance in the due date.
Eliza said.
Her aunt is being stubborn too. Perhaps it runs in the family.
Cate said, grinning and patting her own pregnant belly.
Is Dad here?
Maggie asked.
He's in the waiting room with Arthur and Aaron. They're all afraid to come in.
Cate said.
Well, then they're going to be terrified by this.
Maggie said, then added.
I think my water just broke.
Author's note.
I expected this story to focus more on a love triangle, or at least a perceived one. Some elements of that remained, but as I got to know Theo and Cate better, it didn't make sense. After almost 100 years of a happy marriage, it didn't feel logical for him to be truly conflicted about someone he thought was dead for most of that time. But that doesn't mean there was no conflict. It came mostly from no one being sure how to act. And there was the sci-fi element. Not just the reproduction issue, a major theme on both sides of the story, but also what to do with your time and how people live in a digital world. What type of jobs exist where you can make food appear or turn off the subroutine that makes you hungry? For these characters, work is largely about growth and learning. About trying to make the world a better place, both digital and physical. And now, at the end of the story, it's about raising kids in a digital world who have some concept of the physical world and a connection to humanity. Perhaps it will work, or perhaps in a few generations, most people will see the physical world as just a strange place to gather resources they use to improve the digital world. But even if humanity as it currently exists disappears, the important parts of being human will continue. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, you can sign up for my newsletter at ansci-fi.com and get free stories every week. If you want to help and get access to 40 patron-exclusive short stories and vote on the next exclusive stories, you can sign up for Patreon at any level. Every dollar helps, both in keeping the lights on and in my emotional well-being. Thank you. Elton Gar.